Yeah, good evening. Thanks very much for inviting me along. As Jonathan said, I'm going to use a few slides to break up the kind of talk and to give some images as well for you to look at. My talk, if you can just bear with me just for a moment while I kind of share those slides with you. Okay, so as Jonathan said, I'm going to be talking about confronting Islamophobia and right-wing populism across Europe. I'm going to be drawing upon sort of my own research, but I'm also going to be using a kind of quite a crass kind of approach to do this. One of the things that I've seen in the media a lot is that we've been talking about this kind of idea that in a kind of post-COVID-19 world, we're going to be in this kind of new normal. So what I want to do first off is I want to talk about the old normal, to talk about Islamophobia, to talk about the far right and right-wing populism as it was in the old normal, but then also kind of bring us into kind of where we are with the new normal and kind of talk about some of the ideas that I think, that we may begin to see, some of the developments and the way in which Islamophobia in particular in Europe will begin to develop in terms of that. So I wanted to just start by, as I say, looking at that kind of old normal, and I think it's just a nice way of kind of framing the kind of talk this evening, even though, as I say, it's kind of a little bit kind of media speak. And I think that one of the things that we've seen and that we know, and which my research has increasingly shown, is the way in which Islamophobia has become normalised. And by that, what I'm talking about is it's become accepted. And in the UK, 10 years ago this year, a Baroness Said of Arsi, she spoke about Islamophobia had passed the dinner table test. And what she meant by this was that the things in which we say about Muslims and about the religion of Islam, we wouldn't necessarily say, and it wouldn't be acceptable to say, about other religions and about other minority groups. And there's a civility around being able to say at times some of the most harshest kind of insidious kind of things about Muslims that we just wouldn't accept anywhere else or about anybody else. And so I think that that's what I'm kind of trying to say, is that in those past 2 decades we really begin to see Islamophobia, the kind of negative stereotypes and negative ideas about Muslims, really becoming embedded into our discourses, our way we think, and so on. Now, excuse me. One of the things that I think that what I've seen from my own research is that when you look at the individual kind of nation states, you see that Islamophobia takes on the kind of cultural or the kind of social or the political characteristics of those individual nations. So, for example, sort of Islamophobia in France and Islamophobia in the UK, they will be quite different because of the different historical relations that both of those nation states have had with Muslim countries. So you can see that there's some sort of difference. But when looking across Europe on a kind of pan-European level, what we begin to see there are kind of broad themes that we begin to look at. And amongst those, and when we're looking through the lens particularly of the kind of right-wing populism and of the far right, is that we see the overwhelming thing is that Muslims and the religion of Islam are other. So they're seen to be the other. They're seen to be something that will never ever be a part of Europe or can never ever be European. And linked up with this is, as Sarah said previously, is this idea around kind of immigration and this idea that actually Muslims come into Europe, whether through legal or illegal kind of immigration, as the media tend to put it. This is just merely a kind of smokescreen or a guise for Muslims to begin to invade Europe. And of course, once Muslims are in Europe, then what they do is they are seen to kind of Islamify or kind of take over those individual nation states. And again, they will be reflected in the different nations as to what those processes are. We may see something around building mosques and kind of changing the landscape. We may see kind of issues around kind of high birth rates. We may see stuff around kind of like local and national policies. For instance, like kind of trying to get halal food into kind of school dinners. Again, you're seeing that in terms of the way in which the culture is changing. And really underpinning this is this idea of threat. And there's really kind of four elements to that. There's the violent threat, which is posed by terrorism. There's the cultural threat in changing, as I put there, who we are and what is our culture. And I use those in speech marks. There's the kind of religious kind of changes that replacing the Judeo and Christian traditions of Europe. And then increasingly what we've seen in the past few years is the idea around a kind of sexual threat. In the UK, we have this around kind of grooming gangs and sexual exploitation. In Europe, on the mainland, we tend to see things more around kind of rape gangs, and even the term refugee being used in terms of trying to describe Muslims. Now, just use a couple of images there just to kind of break up the talk a little bit. As we see on the left-hand side, the Daily Mail, a British newspaper with the largest daily circulation. David Cameron, spoke to British Muslims and said, "Be more British." A wholly subjective term, but this idea underpinning that Muslims in the UK aren't British. They need to do more to prove their Britishness, more so than anybody else. In the middle, we have the posters from Switzerland, from the minaret ban, and what we see there is we see two really key images there. You have the Muslim woman wearing a burqa, wearing the face covering, which has always become a kind of instantaneous symbol around otherness. And then you have the minarets not presented as part of a building, not presented as part of a building of worship. What you have there is minarets looking remarkably like missiles. So again, you have that kind of violent threat in terms of that. And then on the right-hand side, you have a Polish magazine, and it has on there the Islamic rape of Europe. And there you have in the middle the white woman wearing the flag of Europe. And of course, there you have the brown men hands kind of grabbing and pulling towards her. So just some images there to give you a kind of feel of the things that I was trying to kind of put across there. Now, one of the things that we do know as well is that over that, almost kind of simultaneously, as Islamophobia has become more kind of normalised and more embedded into our kind of, and into being accepted, is that we've also seen Europe's far right become much more dynamic. And of course, what we have at the forefront of that, is that a lot of the kind of like far right groups that have kind of grown and become more dynamic over those 2 decades really have kind of replaced the more traditional kind of antagonism towards Judaism, to Jewish communities, and of course to a more explicit kind of anti-Semitism, in many ways being replaced with a kind of more explicit Islamophobia, targeting the religion of Islam and targeting Muslim communities. And we've seen some changes as well in there. And in that kind of the first bullet point there, you can see some of those. But I think some of the key things there is this idea around moving away from kind of electoralism to the kind of street level, to direct action that we've seen maybe with Pegida, maybe we've seen with the English Defence League, and also becoming much more loose-knit and informal. So not having a kind of formal established kind of membership, not having those kind of formal networks and so on, but really kind of changing and diversifying in terms of that. And I think one of the things there was what Sarah mentioned earlier, was the way in which the kind of far right have almost become the bastion or the defenders of liberal and civil rights. In the UK, for example, Tommy Robinson now, he seems to be the only defender of free speech, which, 10, 20 years ago would never have been something you would associate with a far right. And of course, with that, the facts that the far right has taken on kind of a much more kind of explicit Islamophobia, is that in terms of this idea of a kind of Islamic invasion, of Islamic kind of takeover, those groups themselves have begun to say that they are defending Europe, that they are resisting the Islamic takeover. So they position themselves in terms of their own discourses around their own Islamophobic discourses. And then what you see is in these 2 decades as well, is this kind of the filtration of these ideas that, from the kind of far right into the kind of political mainstream. And so I've given a few examples there. Berlusconi, for example, talking about Milan being an Islamic, or becoming an Islamic city. The Swedish Democrats referring to that idea around kind of high birth rates. And of course, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban describing the Syrian refugees crisis as part of a master plan. So then we have obviously what we've seen in those 2 decades as well as part of this old normal, and just to kind of wrap up that old normal part, is the rise as well of right-wing populism. And it's really no surprise when you look at something like Viktor Orban, and then you look at the kind of far right, and you think about that space between, Orban really fills that kind of space between the kind of political mainstream and the kind of far right. So we see this beginning to kind of fill in there, and as I've given some examples there, we've got our kind of right-wing populist parties in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Poland. In this country we've had the UK Independence Party as well. Groups which actually sort of in political parties where their ideology is very much against the elites, it's against the establishment, and really keyed in terms of Islamophobia is that they see themselves as being able to talk to the ordinary man, the common people. This idea that actually they're talking in a way that kind of reaches out and touches upon these ordinary people that have been left behind in many ways. And so what you see is that this is something where, again, it's kind of filling that void between the kind of far right and the political mainstream. And of course, it allows for that kind of space to begin to be filtered through. And just that quote there from, or those statistics there from Channel 4 News from 2018, in the previous 5 years to that, around 30 million people in the EU had voted for sort of right-wing populist parties. So what I want to do now is just kind of look at where we are now. So I'm looking at this in terms of the kind of COVID-19, and Sarah's picked up on some of these ideas, because I think that one of the things that we're seeing, if to understand that new normal, we need to understand the transition from the old normal to the new normal, and really the lens of COVID-19 gives us that opportunity to see that. And I think that one of the things we've seen is that there is this kind of idea that actually sort of the far right are beginning to use COVID-19 to reinforce, to reaffirm those kind of Islamophobic discourses that have been in development, that have been kind of beginning to be embedded and normalised for the last 2 decades. And so I've given a few there. For example, there was a claim that by far-right groups that patient zero, so the first person to have COVID-19 in Italy, was a Pakistani Muslim who was working for a Chinese restaurant delivering food. I kind of like the idea there, the kind of cynicism of the way in which the far right there have linked Muslimness with Chineseness as well. To kind of almost kind of seal the kind of circle to say, look, this is actually the case. We've had thousands of tweets using the hashtag Corona Jihad, which is like this idea that, again, part of this idea around taking over is that Muslims have deliberately spread COVID-19 in Europe as a means of kind of wiping out, indigenous Europeans, wiping out some of the white population as a means of strengthening their own position. And then, of course, what we see there as well is that almost the kind of complete opposite, the kind of contradiction of this is that actually sort of, we've had some far-right groups which have actually been suggesting that actually if any of their kind of supporters become infected with COVID-19, that they go and visit some of the most densely populated Muslim areas and try and spread that to them. And when we look at that, when we look down and we see the far right, and then we can see again many of the same issues and many of the same ideas and discourses coming through in terms of those right-wing, populist right-wing groups as well. So New Democracy, for example, in Greece have used the pandemic to push ahead with their controversial detention camps. And just while I'm talking about Greece, I would highlight that one of my PhD candidates is here today, Christina Ferruzzi, and she's doing some fantastic research around Islamophobia in Greece. So I would give the opportunity for people to actually sort of check her out and look at some of her research that she's doing. Also as well, populist parties in, say, France, Germany, Spain, calling for free movement to be suspended, calling for borders to be tightened. So again, we're seeing in this COVID-19 kind of space that what you have there is this idea that actually all of these things are being interlinked. You've got the far right, you've got right-wing populism, you've got immigration, and of course all of that is feeding into Islamophobia. And I just wanted to show you this. This was going around on Twitter. This was being shared by the far right. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a bigger or clearer image. But it says there, what to do if you get COVID-19. Visit your local mosque. visit your local synagogue, spend time in diverse neighbourhoods, spend a day on public transport. And what's most interesting is that there's no signage there from any far-right group, but if you go right down the bottom, it says the World Health Organization. So again, there's this idea, that the far right, are very clever. They're very nuanced in the way in which they kind of pursuing their agenda. Now, as I said, I think that one of the things that we can use the kind of COVID-19 pandemic to do is use that as a lens to look at what will the new normal look like in terms of Islamophobia. And I thought that this would give us a really good insight. So this is a petition that was set up on Britain First's website. If you see on the left-hand side, you've got Britain First. Britain First, they're a well-known far-right group in the UK. It says underneath, taking our country back. Here again, you've got immediately this idea around kind of defending, resisting, this need to defend against Muslims from, to keep Britain first. And this was in a petition which is still live on their website, and it's in response to plans that have been put in to convert part of the ground floor and the basement of the Trocadero building in Piccadilly Circus into a mosque. As you'll see there, they're talking about mega mosque. This is something which the far right has been using for the last decade or so. This idea that size does matter when it comes to a mosque, that actually the bigger the mosque, the bigger the threat that's posed by Muslims. But I wanted to just kind of highlight this for you and just kind of expand on this. And if you have a look here, one of the things that the far right have normally done is talk about this thing around kind of about size, about the number of people that will be going there, the number of worshippers and so on. And when you actually look here, this is a really interesting insight into where I think the future of Islamophobic discourse will go. And what you have there is that instead of just talking now about congestion, about having more Muslims in the area, what you're having now is an argument which is being made there is that actually if you have 1,000 more people in this area, it's going to be very difficult to kind of maintain social distancing. And of course, if you can't maintain social distancing, then the assumption must be that actually there's an opportunity, that there's a chance that COVID-19 will be spread even more virulently. And I think that this is something, so looking at that, using COVID-19 as that lens, I think that this is where we're going to be, where we can see when we go into the new normal. And I think that one of the things that what isn't going to happen is that when we go into this new space, when we go into this kind of new kind of post-pandemic kind of world, I don't think that these old discourses are going to go. You're still going to have the otherness, the invasion, the Islamification threat and so on. But I think that one of the things that you will have there is the idea that there's also now a biological threat. And I think that this may even be something where we actually begin to talk about immigration, where we talk about kind of invasion, where we talk about Muslims overwhelming us. It might actually be something that actually replaces what has been kind of the norm to date, which is the kind of violent or the terrorist threat. And so I think that we need to bear that in mind. I think that we need to look at that in terms of the biological dimension. I think that there's going to be a kind of further alignment and that kind of the bleed between the kind of right-wing populists, the mainstream, the right mainstream political, the right of the political mainstream and the far right. I think that there's going to be much more of an alignment between those. And next year, myself and a good colleague of mine, Alex Overton, we're going to be publishing a book where we're looking at that in the UK in particular. And then I think what the thing we're going to see is, again, we're going to see a much more kind of more formal and informal alliances taking place between, say, the right-wing populist groups, those on the right of the political mainstream, and the far-right groups. And I think that one of the things that we will see is that you will have the far-right taking some of the policies and ideas of the right-wing populists to the street level. I think that will be used to kind of engender fear, to garner kind of support, and also to kind of stoke those tensions that we know exist between different communities. So to wrap up, I wanted to kind of think about that kind of idea of the new normal and how do we confront those old problems, because from the old normal to the new normal, from the kind of old problems to the new problems, I think that what we're going to see is that those issues are exactly the same. And I think that the question is, how do we confront the far right and right wing populism? Now, in terms of that, I don't have any answers. I mean, I think sometimes as academics we feel we should have the answers to pretty much everything. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that. But what I can do is I can give you an answer to how do we confront Islamophobia and other forms of discrimination in the case of the new normal. And I think that there's kind of three responses that we can do. The first is we can really kind of dismiss the issue out of hand. We can kind of ignore it. We can say, okay, right, Islamophobia is just part of our life and our society and our culture, and that's what we do, and we just dismiss that out of hand. I think the second is that we continue to do the same things that have had no impact and have brought about no change whatsoever to date. And I think this includes things such as this kind of pursuit, the elusive pursuit of the one definition of Islamophobia that will allow us to suddenly be able to address these issues. And I think that these are all just smokescreens. These are ways of kind of delaying us and stopping us from achieving anything. I think the third is to kind of bring about this radical change. And I think that needs to be done across the scholarly, the public, and the political spaces. And I think there's two ways in which we can do that, is to challenge, contest, and convince. We need to convince people, not only in the political spaces, but in the public spaces, that Islamophobia is real and it's a problem for our society. And it's not just a problem that will affect Muslim communities, but it's a part of who we are. And in the same way that we are now seeing that, or we are beginning to kind of see a movement that really is convincing people that Black Lives Matter, that racism is a problem. We need to have something where we begin to convince people that Islamophobia is equally a problem. And I think the other thing is around cooperation, collaboration, and corroboration. And we need to really be able to kind of do that. We need to work across our differences. We need to be able to bring about the kind of work across kind of different groups, not have those silos. Really begin to look at these issues on a much wider scale. And I think that if we do that, then I think that one of the things we can do, hopefully, is in that kind of new normal, is bring about a more meaningful change. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chris, for that fascinating